So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor James Longhurst, or Jim, who many of you will be probably more familiar with the name Jim. Jim is a sort of long-standing member and engaged individual with the IAQM, a massive amount of history, being one of the people who helped formed and bring about the Institute of Air Quality Management. So it's fantastic to have Jim here today. I won't recite every line of Jim's bio here to save you from that, because this is a small fraction of his sort of selected past history, and maybe even more recent history, Jim, perhaps. But needless to say, a person we are extremely proud to have as honorary fellow, and it's great to have you here today, Jim. If I can pass across to you to take us forward with your keynote speech, that would be great. I'll man or I'll look after the Q&A chat, and if anyone does have any questions throughout, please drop it in the chat option, and we'll pick those up towards the end if that's how you want to work it.
Well, Chris, thank you very much indeed for bestowing the honorary fellowship upon me. I'm delighted to accept that honour, and I must say good afternoon to everyone who is online. One thing I did want to start with is just to acknowledge a couple of people who, along with me, way back at the turn of the century, were absolutely critical in the formation of the Institute of Air Quality Management. And first of those is Duncan Phillips, who at that time was a scientific officer in Bromley Council, but he was also a part-time PhD student working with me. And Matthew Ireland, who many of you will know. Matthew, a consultant at that time, but also a part-time PhD student working with Bernard Fisher. And I think I saw Bernard's name on the participants list. So hi to Bernard, because you were instrumental in this as well. Between Matthew, Duncan and I, we conceived the idea of an institute that would be a professional body for air quality professionals running across academia, consultancy, and of course local authorities. And at that time, way back at the turn of the century, I was the chair of the IES Council, and I had the opportunity therefore to present to Council the idea that IAQM could be established within the Institution of Environmental Sciences, and that the IES would provide administrative and at that time significant financial resources to get the Institute up and running. So really delighted that here we are now with a significant membership and a really impressive consultancy percentage. I think it was about 78% who are from consultancies. So all of that is great stuff. But let's move on to a keynote address. So I'll just bring my slides up. And Chris, can you just check for me that these are showing on screen?
We can't see them at the minute. Oh, here we go.
Okay, that's great.
Yep.
That's just my
Right.
holding slide. I'll move on to
Perfect.
the title. Okay, lovely. So I'm going to present something which I'm calling an updated analysis of air pollution and its management, viewed through the lens of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll acknowledge the other names you can see on screen at the moment, as those were co-authors for the original piece of work that looked at this way back in 2018. So what I'm going to do is provide a very high-level assessment of air pollution and its management, looking through this framework of the UN SDGs. And it's going to contain an overview of the SDGs. I'm making an assumption many of you may not be overly familiar with the SDGs. I'll say a little bit about the literature that relates to the suite of the SDGs. I'm more interested in this presentation thinking about the interconnectedness of the 17 goals, and look at literature that may or may not make some contribution there. And then I'll say something about air pollution as a constraint on the goals, and air quality management as an enabling contributor to goal attainment. And then conclude with some observations and, as an academic, a call for some further research. And you can read the original paper if you so wish. It's available as a full text in ResearchGate or on the WIP e-library. So those are the 17 goals, the very colourful representation of them. And you can look at the UN websites for an enormous amount of background information about how these were constructed, why, the innate contradictions that exist within some of them. But as a suite of goals, these are really important. And what I want to focus on is this idea of air quality as an enabler, good air quality as the enabler, and air pollution as a constraint that will limit the full potential of attaining the goals. So there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and they have 169 subsidiary targets. And they were adopted by the UN back in September 2015, and they're known as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. They are agreed by the 193 members as a successor to the Millennium Development Goal. A little while later, the Statistical Commission of the UN presented 247 indicators. So as you can see already, there is a raft of complexity in the goals. And what I want to do is just focus at the higher level of the goals through most of this presentation. And the importance, I think, of the goals as they came into force is that they are a universally applicable framework in which the contribution to developing a sustainable future for humanity can be planned and implemented. They are a global agreement. We mustn't forget that in these times where globalization may not always promise as much as it once did, but these are globally agreed. They're universal, they're transformational, they are inclusive, and importantly, they're highly interconnected. And they describe the major development challenges that face humanity. And they're a route map to address a series of outcomes that relate to different dimensions of human needs. And they frame environmental management, and I place air quality management within as a subset of environmental management. They are a contribution to development, and they elevate a vision away from what sometimes might be the minimal regulatory performance criteria towards something that meets a diversity of human needs, and therefore is very consistent with the original work of the Brundtland Commission. They cover economic, environmental, and social dimensions, and they address governance. They can be critiqued, and they often are, but they are this output of consensus. My colleague Mark Everard and I argued back in 2018 that we should consider them as an intimately interdependent suite and understood in a systemic context. We should address all goals as an interconnected set, as a narrow focus on maximizing one goal in isolation risks undermining other interdependent facets. And in this context, air pollution can be seen as a constraint on multiple goals, while air quality management leading to cleaner air can be an enabler. Now, thinking about air quality in the context of the SDGs, it might at first seem surprising that there is no headline goal for air quality or indeed improvements in air pollution. It does, however, feature as 3 specific targets under SDG 3 Health, under SDG 11, the one concerned with cities, and in SDG 12, Sustainable Consumption and Production. But it is merely one of the targets associated with each of those goals, and it isn't even clear if air pollution as a target is actually a priority. Now, I would argue that the impact of air pollution is a barrier to achieving the SDGs, and it is incompatible with the idea of sustainable development. And air quality management should be an integral part of the sustainable development pathway, and thus its role within the SDG framework should be explicit. And it isn't at this point. So it's not a goal, but those goals provide a framework in which we can view issues and the barriers that exist to restrict attainment of those goals. Now, Lode, back in 2016, viewed the SDGs as an opportunity to tackle air pollution at a global scale, stressing, as they did in their paper, the importance of air pollution as a human health hazard, whilst Everard et al. Recognised air as a common good, and therefore we might also argue that clean air constitutes a universal human right, and the SDGs are intimately connected with the notion of human rights. I mentioned the targets, and there are also indicators that pick up on the targets, but the SDG targets are quite loosely written in many ways, and it's only at the level of the indicator that you now see on screen that you will begin to recognize things that air pollution colleagues would work with, such as mortality rates attributed to air pollution, either household or ambient, or mean urban pollution of particulate matter. These indicators are a small number in the total of over 200 indicators, and the targets themselves are very broad. And if we think about air pollution, it is also an issue of social justice and global inequality. Many of you will be familiar with the WHO's work that identifies 97% of cities with more than 100,000 inhabitants in low and middle income countries not meeting air quality guidelines, where that percentage falls to 49 in high income countries. And WHO data shows that almost all of the global population breathes air that exceeds their guidelines, with low and middle income countries suffering the highest exposures. So better management of air pollution can improve social justice outcomes and enhance the move towards a more equal global system. And we can't ignore the urgency that is required in addressing air pollution across the world. It is, after all, described by the WHO as the world's single biggest environmental health threat. And the urban air pollution issues particularly bring a whole raft of different disease outcomes of great concern. And the WHO estimates somewhere in excess of 4 million premature deaths per year due to ambient air pollution, with some 89% of those premature deaths occurring in low and middle income countries, with the greatest number in the WHO Southeast Asia and Western Pacific regions. And you can look in detail about these issues on the WHO website. So thinking a bit more about literature then, WHO themselves describe air pollution as a marker of unsustainable, or conversely better air quality as a marker of sustainable development, and that addressing air pollution generates co-benefits for human health. But very few of the identified publications consider air pollution and the SDGs in a synoptic way, and they don't undertake studies that look at the interconnectedness of the SDGs. Most of the literature that I've identified considers just one goal, most often SDG 3, occasionally SDG 11. Few make overt consideration of the negative impacts, or indeed the positive impacts of an action on a non-target SDG or of the system as a whole. It is very narrow in the way in which scientists and others are thinking about air pollution in the context of the SDGs. This notion of the SDGs as interconnected as an indivisible system is absent from much of the work. Elder and Zussman discussed the linkage between air pollution and SDGs in a policy brief for the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, seeing a link between 10 of the SDGs and an implicit link in target level in 14 of the 169 targets. Farmer, in an undated publication, considered air pollution in connection to the SDGs related to poverty, hunger, and gender equality, and noted the importance of considering the goals as an integrated whole. and made strong recommendations about interactions between pollution and poverty. And I'll come on to say more of that in a little while. The various European Environment Agency publications, such as the Air Quality in Europe report, have in the past made reference to the SDGs. For example, citing in the 2017 report, EU policies targeting air pollution directly or indirectly work towards achieving 12 of the 17 goals. But the negative impact of policies were not considered on any of the individual goals or of the suite as a whole. And interestingly, the most recent reports on air quality in Europe make little or no reference to the SDGs. My colleague Mark Everard and I provided a case study of the local air quality management process in the UK, looking to operationalize the SDGs in the context of air pollution. And we identified a direct impact on 3 of the SDGs and an indirect benefit on a further 9, with a supporting role being identified for SDG 16. But even in that work, we didn't really pay attention to the negative impacts on the individual SDGs of actions that were being taken. And so the opportunity I think we missed in that was to try and look at the integrated network of the SDGs. In 2018, the group of authors that you saw right at the beginning on my opening slide, that's where we produced the original work considering air pollution through this lens of the SDGs, where we identified a number of very significant relationships, and it provides the basis for this reassessment 6 years on. I just wanted to say a little bit about the air quality guidelines that the WHO produces before I move into consideration of the individual goals. Many of you will be very familiar with this document, and I was very pleased to see that that 2018 paper was actually referenced in the guidelines. And the air quality guidelines describe the SDGs as a means to address the public health threat posed by air pollution via specific targets to reduce pollution exposure and the disease burden. They go on to say, this burden is unevenly distributed and it impedes the reduction of inequities and progress to achieving full human rights. And global efforts to reduce pollution will have a positive impact on lowering inequity. And they go on to connect that to the Declaration of Human Rights and also Article 3 of the 1948 Charter. They go on to say that it is a framework that they see as being able to combat air pollution at the global level. And within the framework, the guidelines identifies a connection between 10 of the goals and air pollution with further implicit links at target level. And they note that for SDG 17, the partnership goal, it offers targets for intersectoral, multi-level and multi-stakeholder collaboration to address air pollution, and that these are aligned with the Paris Agreement on climate change. So beginning to draw together a number of connections, but still not fully bringing the full suite of systemic analysis to the forefront. So moving then on to considering the goals, just want to note that the original work we did was a small expert group using a Delphi process to identify 2 judgments. In the context of each goal, is air pollution a barrier to the attainment of that goal? And will the management of air pollution enhance or enable attainment of the goal by 2030? Considering direct and indirect impacts at the goal level, there were 8 individuals involved in the original piece of work, There were 4 iterations of information exchange with lots of argument, as one might expect, with 8 individuals holding strong views. What I have been doing over the last year is updating that assessment, reviewing the observations and considering how things might have changed as the literature has changed. I think the outcomes still remain broadly valid, even though it's 6 years on. And I think the negative impacts that I'll come on to talk about that were identified in 2018 still remain, but the positive benefits of air quality management, if anything, are clearer today. So I'm going to now take you through the 17 goals and making some very high-level statements about the way in which air pollution and then the management of air pollution might be viewed when one considers the goal. So firstly, poor people tend to suffer much more from air pollution, whilst their emissions tend to be smaller than their wealthier fellow citizens. Polluted environments are less attractive for economic investment, thus reducing opportunities for new enterprises to be established and employment opportunities to be created. Low-income families are potentially most at risk from air pollution exposure and are least able to change their circumstances to avoid exposure. Excuse me. Those in poverty may also be more at risk from the health impacts in terms of system severity, duration, and access to medicine. But managing pollution concentrations potentially creates a more attractive environment for inward investment, and reductions in air pollution can enable healthcare cost savings and enhance productivity, thus reducing the number of working days that may be lost. So action to address air quality management can bring indirect benefits for this goal, whereas air pollution directly affects SDG 1. SDG 2 is concerned with hunger, and there are obvious direct impacts from air pollution upon food resources, reducing crop yields, increasing the risk of food insecurity. Nitrogen compounds, ozone and sulfur species, particularly of concern. Poorly nourished, ill or low-income families most likely to be at risk from air pollution impacts. Eutrophication of water resources due to nitrogen species deposition can reduce availability of foodstuffs. Farming practices encouraging crop burning can impact crops growing in surrounding fields, as well as increasing risks to farm workers and local residents, and can contribute to medium or longer range transport of air pollutants, as we're seeing currently in Pakistan and India. So efforts to reduce emissions reduces the risks to crops and reduces the risk of food insecurity. So direct benefits can be identified through air quality management practices. Thinking about good health and well-being, probably the one of the SDG goals that gets the most attention in relation to air pollution. It is, of course, a major risk to human health. The elderly, the already ill, the very young are most at risk from exposure. Emerging evidence suggests neurological and epigenetic connections. There are, of course, particular risk to pregnant women, and their exposure may also impact the fetus, with impacts on birth weights, infant mortality, etc., etc. Air pollution can reduce the attractiveness of physical activity, but targeted interventions in low-income countries, for example, phasing out residual lead in petrol, can reduce inequalities in exposure. And emission reduction efforts, therefore, will have the potential to improve health, reduce expenditure on pollution-related healthcare costs, and thus bring direct benefits for achievement of this goal. SDG 4 is concerned with quality education. And of course, air pollution can have a direct impact on this goal. It can affect the neurological and cognitive development of the young. It can also, of course, have linked impacts on food insecurity and poverty, affecting young people, reducing the benefit of educational opportunities. Indeed, in highly polluted environments, smog events may lead to short-term school closures, as we're seeing in parts of Asia at the moment. But efforts to reduce emissions and limit exposure reduces the longer-term and short-term risks to people, especially the young, who will then benefit from those opportunities in education. Improving air quality can lead to fewer days of education missed due to pollution-related illness or school closures, and thus a direct benefit of air quality management can be seen for this goal. SDG 5 is concerned with gender equality and, again, a direct impact of air pollution. Lower middle-income countries, women are much more at risk from exposure to indoor air pollution associated with cooking practices. The WHO back in 2016 estimated some 3 billion people cook using polluting open fires or simple stoves fueled by kerosene, biomass, or even coal. WHO identifies around 4 million people a year dying prematurely from illness that is attributable to household air pollution caused by these inefficient cooking methods. So efforts to improve the emission performance of cooking practices in lower middle income countries can improve that indoor air quality environment with knock-on health and well-being benefits, particularly for women. So actions to address ambient air quality management will have some indirect benefits because there is an inflow from the ambient into indoor environments, but in this judgment will be indirect. Clean water and sanitation is SDG 6, and again we can see direct air pollution impacts. Watercourses can be affected by dry and wet deposition of acidifying compounds. Local bioaerosol and odor emissions from sanitation can be an issue around wastewater treatment works, etc. Indirect emissions from energy to run purification and sewage works may also contribute to local pollution issues. So efforts to reduce emissions can have beneficial impacts on watercourses and on the reduction in airborne emissions. We can also see improved sanitation systems leading to improved odor issues. So actions on this goal, on air quality management rather, can bring direct benefits for this goal. Turning to SDG 7 and renewable energy, again, direct impacts can be identified from air pollution. Waste burning is common for heat and cooking in low-income countries and can be a major and unregulated emission source in megacities in low-income and some middle-income countries. We can see the effectiveness of renewable energy systems affected by air pollution, their efficiency reduced due to smog, dust, or haze. But renewable sources of energy quickly establishing themselves as cost-effective alternatives to fossil fuels, and thus will bring significant health benefits in time from reduced risks of pollutant exposure. There are opportunities to reduce emissions through energy substitution and efficiency measures, but measures to improve access to energy supply will need to be implemented sustainability if the benefits of these actions are to be felt in reduced emissions. So looking at air quality management and this goal, we can see direct benefits through enhanced air quality management practices. Decent work and economic growth is the next SDG. We're about halfway through the SDGs now. Direct impacts again. The costs in high, low, and middle income countries can be significant. Air pollution creates direct healthcare impacts, which lead to productivity losses through ill health. There are also crop losses, climate impacts, and effects on the built environment. Air pollution contributes to absences from work due to ill health and a negative impact through productivity losses. There are particular opportunities for investments in new technologies and in public transport, renewables, energy conservation, measures which together will bring improvements in the air pollution situation. So action to address air quality management can bring a range of indirect benefits for SDG 8. SDG 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure. Again, we can see direct impacts on this goal. Of course, industrial emissions, power generation, transport are major contributors to air pollution. And we see that in polluted environments, the acceleration of corrosion of stone and metalwork leading to increased repair costs. Actual or perceived pollution may inhibit industrial, commercial or service location choices. And there are significant opportunities there for cost savings in stone and metalwork renovation through emission reduction programs. And we can see, therefore, that action to address air quality management will bring a range of probably indirect benefits for this goal. Reducing inequalities is SDG 10. Again, we see direct impacts. Distribution of air pollution sources and their impacts are not equal. The elderly, the young, the poor, the already ill, as we've already noted, are most at risk, and risk is unequal across the globe. Developed nations, unlike low or middle income countries, developed countries are much more able to carry the cost of monitoring and managing pollutant risk. So reducing emissions at a global level will lower the exposure risk of those most sensitive in society and reduce gross inequalities in health outcomes. Reductions in air pollution will enable healthcare cost savings and enhance economic productivity, reducing the number of working days lost due to ill health. And as we've said, those in poverty are likely to be responsible for the least emissions and may suffer disproportionately from the emissions of the well-off. And given long-range transport of pollutants, that is not just a local issue. So action to address air quality management will bring direct benefits for this goal. Moving to sustainable cities and communities, again, a series of direct impacts. Air pollution can negatively affect the external perception of cities, especially in megacities. And air pollution has a range of knock-on consequences, such as reducing citizens' use of outdoor space and restricting demand, development, and use of active travel. So efforts to improve livability of cities, such as emission reduction programs, will reduce the risk of exposure and lower the fraction of population morbidity and mortality resulting from air pollution. And emission reduction programs can enhance demand for and stimulate the development of active travel infrastructure. So again, we can see actions addressing air quality management can bring direct benefits for this goal. Moving to 12, responsible consumption and production, again, a series of direct impacts. Consumption-driven economies demand production through industrial activity, service provision, and logistics systems, all creating emissions that contribute to air pollution problems within and beyond the consuming country. Outsourcing practices transfer poor air quality to other regions and countries. But within construction and demolition, as an example, we see major sources of emission challenges, particularly in rapidly developing cities in the global south. And subsidies for fossil fuel use perpetuate oil, gas, and coal-based economic systems and their resultant air pollution impacts. So actions to address air quality management are going to have direct benefits for this goal. SDG 13 is concerned with climate action. And again, of course, direct impacts can be identified with the full range of fossil fuel emissions and agricultural emissions contributing to a changing climate. But emissions mitigation will reduce the impact on natural and human systems. A changing climate, though, may lead to changes in energy demand, for example, in air conditioning, air conditioning, and lead to changes in the annual pattern of emissions. And a changing climate could also lead to changes in the relative abundance and location of secondary pollutants, perhaps ozone or volatile organics. And we may also see quite significant dispersion pattern changes under different climate changes. So addressing air quality management can bring direct benefits for SDG 13, as indeed they will for 14, life below water, where of course there are direct impacts on marine and freshwater life from acidification and eutrophication, from the accumulation of metals or persistent organic compounds, and from the accumulation of nano and microplastics deposited into fresh or marine environments, with risks therefore in the food chain. So emission reductions through air quality management can bring direct benefits, as indeed they will for SDG 15, life on land, where direct impacts are very clear. Impacts on vegetation from ambient concentrations and from dry and wet deposition pathways. Vegetation can be an effective barrier to particle movement in the air, and some pollutants, of course, are absorbed by vegetation. Certain types of vegetation, though, can be a source of emission for organic compounds, contributing to regional haze. But overall, actions on air quality management will bring direct benefits for this goal. SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. We can see direct benefits, direct impacts from air pollution on this goal. Air pollution's contribution to climate instability will reduce access to key resources, may lead to resource conflict at the local or international scale, and will undoubtedly lead to increased numbers of environmental refugees. But policies to address emission reductions can help reduce the risk of conflict over scarce resources, as indeed will improving resource efficiency and minimizing emissions. Air quality management initiatives require strong state environmental institutions and civil society engagement to ensure the environmental justice is present as a goal of policy, and that effective regulatory systems are designed, implemented, and importantly, enforced to improve air quality. These actions are necessary in high, middle, and low-income countries. So action to address air quality management will bring direct benefits for this goal and will address environmental injustices. So the final SDG, you'll be pleased to know, is 17, partnerships for the goal. And again, we see direct impacts. A lack of partnership working to address air pollution and climate action at local, national, and international level leads to policy gaps and a lack of engagement. Global, regional, national, and local partnerships can raise awareness of issues, identify priority actions, implement change management processes to regulate emissions and concentrations, and promote behaviour change initiatives. Excuse me. Civil level partnerships on emission reduction efforts raise awareness of the current impacts of emissions and stimulate actions for change. So actions on air quality management can bring direct benefits for this goal and provide a demonstration of partnership working in practice. So when viewed through the lens of the SDGs, we can identify air pollution as directly affecting each one of the goals, and it can act as a constraint or barrier to attaining an individual SDG and to the suite of 17 interconnected goals. Identifying the scale and nature of the impacts and any location-specific factors needs further assessment, but the overall impact and any location-specific factors needs further assessment. But the overall impact on goal attainment is clear. Conversely, air quality management action is an enabler of goal attainment, and 13 SDGs, air quality management is identified as a direct enabler, with the remaining 4 identified as indirect enabling of that goal. But again, the scale and nature of the benefit needs further elucidation, but the benefits of action are clear. So visually, those are all of the goals where air pollution is the constraint on goal achievement. There are good air quality enablers for 13 of the goals. For 4 of them, it's an indirect enabler. I'm thinking about a few conclusions as I begin to head towards wrapping up. The synoptic analysis has considered this overall impact of air pollution as a barrier to achieving the goals, but has also considered the role of better or improved air quality management as an enabler. Now, we can argue, perhaps, as Lode has done in that 2016 paper, that the 2030 agenda is merely some non-binding soft law framework with no proper enforcement and compliance mechanism. And there is some truth in that, but the SDGs remain the only globally agreed pathway to a more sustainable future. It may be unfortunate that there isn't an individual SDG that is specifically addressing air pollution and its management, but given that air pollution is cross-cutting through each of the SDGs, that might not be as significant a concern as first thought. In fact, it might force us to think more about synoptic system-wide consideration. It's therefore a framework that provides a means for us to conduct policy appraisal and impact assessment at both goal and target level for the suite of SDGs. But much further work is required to operationalize this potential. We can think about addressing air pollution in an integrated manner through the interconnectedness of the goals, but further work is necessary to understand how policies to address the goals collectively, as well as individually, can be devised and implemented to ensure that air quality improvements are embedded in goal and target action plans. Further research is needed to assess the air pollution impacts and the benefits of air quality management on the overall suite of SDG targets and indicators. But there are huge benefits. And noting the interconnection of the SDGs, commitments to meeting an individual SDG should not be at the expense of imposing air pollution costs on other goals. And the SDGs are particularly significant, I think, in reasserting the vision of sustainable development as one of meeting intergenerational human needs. It's not just of today, but it is of tomorrow. And the importance of air pollution as addressing as a constraint on sustainable development, I think, is of fundamental importance, as is the positive enabling contributions of clean air to meeting the SDGs. And that needs much greater recognition than hitherto. So with that, can I say thank you for your attention. I hope you found this interesting and perhaps a little different to the normal fare at an IAQM meeting, trying to lift this into a much more global consideration. So I shall stop sharing now, Chris, and come back to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. That was that was fascinating, and I think, very eye-opening. I hope I hope many of you are aware that we sit in a much wider world of sustainability effectively, and sustainability covers everything, right? So I think everyone does. So to know that we exist as part of a bigger whole is great, rather than it's just our air quality piece and that's it. We have a much bigger platform than I think we give ourselves credit for sometimes. And I think that how we access that and how we engage with that and how we work with those SDGs on a daily basis as academics, consultants, air quality professionals, as an IAQM professional body, is really interesting. It'd be something that'd be really good to explore. There's a couple of questions that popped up in the Q&A, and please do, if anyone does have any questions or even comments or food for thought, please do add them into the Q&A. I don't know if it's called chat part, but Q&A piece of Zoom. I'll read the couple we've got. Some of them might be more comments, but we'll welcome your thoughts, Jim, on them. So the first one is, we should include asthma sufferers and mortality rates together, perhaps to show more weight to the urgency of the issues of the air. So around probably air quality, I'd imagine, and the issues around achieving clean air. I suppose that's all around how do we help to elevate it. There seems to be so much research around air quality, or all the impacts of of air pollution, at least. I suppose it's how do we take that off the ground, really? Do you feel, Jim, that we have that information already, or is it something that should be more highlighted, or is it something that we could be using to maybe not leverage, but help make visible the invisible?
Absolutely, making visible the invisible is a very good way of putting it. And that information is there, and it's a question of how we mobilize the information and show the interconnectedness and the way in which that interconnectedness can help drive change. We tend to take very siloed positions on a lot of things, and trying to see a broader systemic perspective can help break some of the barriers that silo thinking and the response to a silo thinking engenders.
It's really difficult, isn't it? No, thank you for that. Probably someone touching on your past, Jim, in a good way, and wanting to pick into that a little bit. Has the IAQM developed in the way that the founders envisaged? Where have we exceeded your expectations, and where might you have hoped we would have achieved more? That's quite interesting.
That's
nice
a
way
really
of putting it.
That's a really nice question. Thank you, whoever that was. Well, if I was brutally honest, way back in the turn of the century, I don't think Duncan, Matthew, or I really knew what the potential would be. There was this sort of sense that with the LAQM work kicking off across all of the local authorities, then there were scientific officers in local authorities who didn't have a home and were looking for a home. And there were consultants who could see that air quality management was going to be a really important part of their future business. So there was this latent potential. And I think now, I think you said well over 700 members, was it, Chris?
That's right.
That's a pretty substantial body of people who actually saw an opportunity for them to find like-minded people, to be able to have the conversations and the training opportunities and the conferences, all the things you were talking about in your chair's summary of the year. That's what people were looking for. We hope that there were a lot of people out there way back when who were looking for that. And I'm hugely grateful to the Institution of Environmental Sciences that they saw that there was a gap in the professional body market, and that the IAS could embrace that opportunity, and IAQM could find its place within the IAS family. I think there's still more opportunity for IAQM internationally as well as nationally. It's interesting that the membership now is, I think, 78%. 78%, I think it was, of members are from consultancies of one sort or another. That's probably as much a reflection of the changing financial circumstances and fortunes of local authorities.
Yeah.
But there is still potential for significant growth in national membership.
Yeah.
And there is a whole wide world out there where IAQM skills, expertise, and the knowledge of how to do things in a collaborative manner can help accelerate progress towards cleaner air.
That's great. Thank you. Very positive. Thanks, Jim. One other question was, thank you, Jim. You make a compelling case about the interconnections of air quality and sustainable development. In my experience, there are challenges in getting joined up government action when impacts and effects cut across departments. We have met this with climate change and net zero, where there are clear parallels. Do you have any advice on how to gain traction to push air quality up the agenda? Maybe even get the clean air bill moving again?
Oh, it'd be great to see it'd be great to see the Clean Air Bill getting some more impetus, and IAQM and EPIC and others putting their weight behind kind of a reinvigoration of that. But absolutely, things that cut across boundaries do find themselves either disowned or not owned by one or both parties, claiming it's the other's responsibility. The best advice I can give is to be well informed about the benefits that will accrue to all parties, and to be persistent, always be polite, but be very persistent in pursuing what you know to be right, even if those you're trying to convince are stonewalling you for internal reasons. We know the arguments for why air quality improvements are necessary. It is our moral responsibility, perhaps, putting it as strongly as that, is our moral responsibility to pursue those arguments to their logical conclusion, and to ensure that those who at first do not accept or are unable to accept our arguments see the error of their ways.
I like that. Yeah, no, fantastic. Thanks for that, Jim. There's no, I mean, I was going to ask a bit of a similar question, but I think it would mean you repeating your points there, really, and you know, it was so well put. I don't think there's any other immediate questions on the chat.
There's a few in the chat. Sorry, Chris, to interrupt. There's a few in the chat separate from the Q&A.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. Oh, people going off piece. That's great. Well, keeps me flicking between windows. Thank you for that. I'll read the few I've picked up then. How do you think we can increase our membership and attendance at events from academia and local authorities? We have done quite well with consultants, but still get low interest from academia and local authorities.
Okay, so local authorities, I think the challenge there is the vast reduction in resources in local authorities that has led to a reduction in headcount in all of the areas of a local authority that would deal with air quality. I don't think there's much good news I can offer on a local authority membership, but academia, I think it's about finessing the argument. What is it that academics can benefit from IAQM membership? What is the USP for them? And if that can be conceptualized, and there are a good number of people, I think Anil Namdeo, who's joining the committee, will have some great ideas, maybe not wishing to put tasks in front of Anil, but he is a friend, so maybe I can. That will be something perhaps Anil might like to pursue. There is a broad community of academics working in air quality, many of whom will be well known to others in the IAQM. Maybe there's an IAQM membership-wide invitation to buddy up to your friendly academic and ask them why they're not members. What is it that would encourage them to join, and listen to those responses and respond accordingly.
Brilliant. I think Anna will like being volunteered as well, so that's quite good. He's not even had his first committee meeting, but we'll get the action sorted there. So that's great. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, and others like Joe Barnes and
of course,
Hayes. They'll also have strong views, and I'm sure can be co-opted into helping to see putting actions on there already for to-do list.
I'm scribbling people's names down as you mentioned them. That's great. Another question: do you think there are sufficient economic drivers and incentives to achieve these goals in the low and middle income world? I.e., can we rely on regulation and enforcement, and are these measures wholly effective and likely to be properly implemented? Do the benefits need to be directly tangible to the emitters? So quite a few few requests in. We're bouncing around sort of membership history on the IAQM and back to your sort of meat of the presentation, but it keeps things interesting, right?
Yeah, and this must be Roger Barracliff, I would think.
So hi, Roger. Yeah, thank you, Roger. Yeah, thanks, Roger.
So no, very simple. The economic drivers and incentives. Well, if we just look at what's been happening in the COP in Azerbaijan and the difficulties of global North developed countries finding mechanisms to support lower middle income countries in responding to climate change, the answer to the first part of the question is no. The economic drivers and the economic driver is clear because there are real damages. The driver for change is clear. The drivers to resource the change are at one level very clear, but the financial resources to make the drivers take effect and are not available in lower middle income countries, and global financial institutions are unable without incurring enormous debts through private financial transfer to actually have any strong material benefit at the scale required. In an ideal world, regulation and enforcement should be effective, but we know that unless you resource the enforcement regimes effectively and efficiently, they will not deliver the intended goals because they're incapacitated by the circumstances they are likely to be working within. And I can't recollect what the third part of Roger's question was, sorry.
It was, do the benefits need to be directly tangible to the emitters, was the last part, but
yes, yeah, I mean, but I guess that is the case.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jim, and thanks for dealing with my sort of sporadic Q&A style of keeping you guessing on what topics we're going to focus on. But it's good when we've got a few different ways of people getting their questions through, which is great. I don't think there are any more either in the chat or the Q&A function. So what we'll do is I'd just like to say thank you, Jim, again for such a fantastic keynote speech and presentation, and thank you for being our honorary fellow. It's great, and I look forward to working with you moving forward a lot more. And thank you again, everyone who's joined today and who might be watching this back as well, as this is recorded, the keynote presentation, so that will be circulated as well. So thank you to everyone there, and just leaves me to say thank you again for joining, and yeah, have a good afternoon. We'll close there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.